Now, when it comes to dealing with these signals, I also have this mark as completed button here. And when that is clicked, I want to make sure that this signal does get marked as completed, which here only means that this button shouldn't be shown anymore and this icon color here, or this circle color here, should change. Now, to change the status of a ticket, we have to go back to the tickets component though, because it's there where I'm managing all those tickets. So it's there where I also want to update the status of a ticket. To be precise, in that tickets component, it makes sense to add a onClose ticket method or something like that. The name, of course, is up to you, to close a specific ticket. And I expect to get the ID of the ticket that should be closed, which should be of type string, as an argument here, as a parameter in onClose ticket. And with that, we could then change the value of tickets, so of this tickets property, and set this equal to a new array where I'm taking the old array, but I'm mapping every ticket to a new value. And map is a default method built into JavaScript. It takes a function that will be executed for every element in that array, and it will get that element as an argument then automatically. The browser will call this function. And then here I want to check if ticket.id is equal to the ID I'm getting here as a parameter. Because if that's the case, I know that I'm currently looking at the ticket that should be marked as closed. So in that case, I want to map that ticket item to a new object where I spread in all the old properties with help of that spread operator, which is a default JavaScript operator, not TypeScript and not Angular specific. And I'm using it here to create a new object into which I copy and paste all the existing key value pairs. But I'm then overriding the status key and I'm setting this to closed now. So I'm overriding that existing ticket in that tickets array with a new object where the status is set to closed. Alternatively, I'll return the unchanged ticket if I'm looking at some other ticket with a different ID. That would be one way of updating this tickets array such that a ticket that is clicked or that should be closed is replaced with a ticket where the status is set to closed. Now, to trigger onClose ticket, we must make sure that we emit some event, some custom event from inside the ticket component that does trigger this onClose ticket method in the tickets component. So back in the ticket component, we can add a new property here. Close could be the name. And I'll use the output function to create my custom event here. Imported from @AngularCore. Of course, the output decorator combined with event emitter would be the alternative. But here I'll do it like this. And I want to emit this event whenever the user does click on that mark as completed button. For that, I'll add a method here to the ticket component on mark as completed, where I'll call this close emit. And I'm actually not passing any data along with this event, though we could do that. But here I'm fine with an event that does not carry any data. Now, on mark as completed should be triggered from inside the ticket component template whenever this mark as completed button here is clicked. So here I'll add that click listener and trigger on mark as completed. With that, I'm then emitting this close event, and in the tickets component, or to be precise, there in the template, on that ticket, we can now listen to that close event and trigger the onClose ticket method, though I now need to pass the ID of the ticket that should be marked as closed to that method. But thankfully, I can easily get hold of that ID by using ticket.id. Because I have that ticket variable available here in that for loop. And that holds all the ticket data. So I can pass it along to onCloseTicket here. And with that, the ticket should be updated and should be marked as completed. Now, to reflect the completion status back in the ticket component HTML file, I also want to update those dynamically assigned classes here and set the class to ticket open if data.status is open, and set it to closed if data.status is closed. So if the ticket is marked as open, this CSS class should be applied. Otherwise, this one should be applied. And with all that done, if I add a new ticket, initially I have this color for this circle, but if I click mark as completed, this mark as completed button disappears and the circle color changes. Of course, if I add more tickets, those tickets are not marked as completed. So that works independent per ticket. Now, at this point, we're almost done with this application, but of course, this section was never primarily about this application. Instead, it's about diving deeper into components, templates, and related features. And there still are some features that should be covered. For example, if you're dealing with inputs and outputs, you got some configuration options here, which you should know about. And when using that input function, you can set that configuration by passing an object to it, though only if you have required here. Otherwise, that would be the default value. So then you should actually pass the configuration object as a second value. With required, there is no default value, so then you only pass the configuration object to input. If you're using @input, so this decorator, then the configuration object is passed directly to that input decorator. Now, what can you configure here though? Well, you can, for example, set an alias. And that does what the name implies. It allows you to change the name of the input. If for some reason you want to use data as a name in this ticket component, but some other name outside of this component, you could do this here. I could, for example, set this to data and rename this here to ticket. Now I would have to change it in the template as well, but since I'll revert back soon, I'll not do that. But with that, we would now still use data as an input name in the place where we're binding the input. But inside of the component, we would be using this property name. Now, I'll go back to using data internally and to not using an alias because it's actually not recommended to use an alias. You should only do that if you have a good reason for going for this approach, since it otherwise can cause some confusion. Another configuration setting you have here is that you can set up a transform function. So you can set up that transform option and provide a function as a value here. And that function will get the input value as an input and can then return a transformed value. You could, for example, use that to perform some cleanup work or to change the type of the input value, though you also should be careful with that, and you should make sure that you're not performing any transforms that could make the usage of this component confusing or unclear. Here I don't need that, but it's worth knowing about these different features. That you can set up such a transformer function and that you can assign an alias. And for output, it's similar. You can also pass a configuration object to output, and of course also to the output decorator. Though here it's actually only an object if you're using the output function, because you only have one option here. You can set an alias, just as you could for the input, to give this event a different name outside of this component than inside of it. For the output decorator, you therefore just directly pass the alias as a value to @output. Now with that, we would listen to close ticket here instead of close if that is the alias we assign. Now I will go back to close again and not assign that alias because it's also discouraged for that, but you should know about these options, and that's why I mentioned them here, that you can set up transformer functions for inputs and aliases for both inputs and outputs. Now, with all that and with all that usage of inputs and outputs, I'll go back to that new ticket component, and I want to revisit the approach we're using for extracting the entered input data. I'm currently doing this with template variables like this, and that approach is absolutely fine, of course. It works fine and there is no reason to change it here. But earlier in the course, you learned about two-way binding, and I want to revisit this here and then also show you how you can make your own components two-way bindable, which is something we haven't done before. But let's start by revisiting two-way binding on input elements. As you learned earlier in the course, you can use the special ngModel directive, which is unlocked by the forms module, to two-way bind input elements or related elements, so text area elements and so on. And we can use this here in the new ticket component to add some new properties that should be managed with help of two-way binding. And you can either use signals or non-signal properties, as you also saw before in the course. And here I'll start with non-signal properties. So I will add an entered title property, which should be an empty string initially, and an entered text property, which also is an empty string initially. Back in the new ticket component template, we can then use ngModel with that two-way binding syntax, which looks like this: square brackets around parentheses around ngModel, to set and bind the entered title here, and do it on the text area to set and bind the entered text. Now with that, we can actually get rid of the parameters that are passed to onSubmit and get rid of the title input and text input template variables, because I'm now switching to using two-way binding for getting that user input. So in the new ticket component TypeScript file, in onSubmit, we should no longer expect those parameters. And instead, for emitting the add event, we now want to reference entered title and entered text here. With that, if you save everything, you should get the same behavior as before. I can submit these tickets and everything works the way it did before. We could now also clear the form in a different way, because now instead of calling reset on the form, since I'm using two-way binding, which means I'm not just listening to changes to those inputs, but I can also send new values back into them, we can clear both inputs by resetting entered title and entered text back to empty strings after we extracted their values. So here, after calling emit, we can set entered title back to an empty string and entered text back to an empty string. And by doing this, thanks to two-way binding, you'll see that the form will still be reset because, yeah, as mentioned, we're passing values back into those inputs. But that's of course nothing new. You did learn about two-way binding before. Now, however, we'll set up custom two-way binding for our own component.